A teacher ridiculed a little girl from a poor family, not knowing she had an extraordinary gift for mathematics. When the truth was revealed, he broke down in tears. No one could have imagined what would happen next. A story of resilience and hope that will touch your heart. Welcome back. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel and enjoy the story. Fiona Harper was never the most talkative girl in the classroom. At just 9 years old, with copper-colored hair that framed a face too serious for her age, she'd learned that silence was safer than any word. Ever since her father had abandoned them 3 years ago and her mother had fallen gravely ill with pneumonia, Fiona carried a weight in her chest no child should ever bear. Each morning, she awoke in the small, creaky house she shared with her grandmother in Detroit, where the walls moaned during frigid Michigan nights and the smell of mold was as common as the wind slipping through the cracks in the windows. Winter had settled over the city like a merciless blanket, and Fiona pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her small frame as she trudged through the snow toward Lincoln Elementary School. The coat, once bright blue and now faded to an indistinct gray, had belonged to her mother as a child. It no longer closed properly at the front, forcing Fiona to cross her arms over her chest to trap what little warmth she could. Her shoes, worn through at the soles, did little to protect her feet from the biting cold of the pavement. With each step, she could feel every ridge, every stone, every patch of ice beneath her feet. Upon arriving at school, Fiona was met, not only by the sideways glances of her classmates, but also by the open disdain of Mr. Zanders, the fifth-grade math teacher. A tall man with thinning hair and perpetually pursed lips, Mr. Zanders had taken an inexplicable dislike to Fiona from the moment she had been transferred to his class mid-year, after her previous teacher had gone on maternity leave. "Late again, Miss Harper," he said, as Fiona quietly slipped into the classroom, her cheeks still red from the cold, snowflakes melting in her hair. "I suppose punctuality is as foreign a concept to you as basic arithmetic." A few students snickered, and Fiona felt her face grow hotter. She hurried to her seat at the back of the room, keeping her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. As she sat down, she noticed that the seat of her chair was wet. Someone had deliberately spilled water there. With no time to find another seat, and unwilling to draw more attention to herself, Fiona sat down anyway, feeling the cold dampness seep through her already threadbare jeans. Mr. Zanders had begun writing equations on the blackboard, his chalk scraping against the surface with an authority that made Fiona's stomach tighten with anxiety. "Today we're reviewing fractions, which I'm sure most of you have mastered by now, with some notable exceptions, of course." His eyes flicked briefly to Fiona, who shrank further into her seat. The truth was, Fiona understood fractions perfectly. She understood far more than that. In the privacy of her grandmother's attic, illuminated by a flashlight with batteries that were perpetually on the verge of dying, Fiona pored over her grandfather's old college mathematics textbooks. Before his death 2 years ago, her grandfather, a former engineer, had recognized something special in his quiet granddaughter, a natural affinity for numbers that went far beyond what was typical for a child her age. He'd begun teaching her algebra when she was 6, and by the time he passed away, she was already tackling simple calculus problems. But no one at school knew this. To them, to Mr. Zanders, she was just the poor girl with the strange, faraway look in her eyes who never raised her hand in class. "Harper," Mr. Zanders' sharp voice cut through Fiona's thoughts. "Since you're clearly so engrossed in our lesson, perhaps you'd like to solve this problem for the class." Fiona looked up at the board. Mr. Zanders had written a complex problem, involving the addition and multiplication of fractions with different denominators. It was the kind of problem most fifth graders would struggle with, but to Fiona, the answer was immediately clear. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. She could feel every eye in the classroom on her, some curious, some already anticipating her failure with barely concealed glee. "We're waiting, Miss Harper," Mr. Zanders said, tapping his chalk against the board impatiently. "Or do fractions confuse you? Perhaps we should start with something simpler. Do you even know what subtraction is?" The class erupted in laughter, and Fiona felt as though she were shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller, until she might disappear entirely. It wasn't the first time Mr. Zanders had humiliated her, but each instance cut deeper than the last. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Fiona gave the correct answer. Mr. Zanders blinked, momentarily taken aback. Then his face settled back into its customary sneer. "I think that was just luck, class. Let's pretend she knows what she's talking about." He turned back to the board, effectively dismissing her, and continued with the lesson. Fiona felt her face burn, but she was already used to swallowing her tears. She had learned long ago that crying only made things worse. It only confirmed what everyone already thought of her, that she was weak, pathetic, deserving of their contempt. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of muted colors and distant voices. Fiona moved from class to class like a ghost, present but unseen. At lunch, she sat alone at the far end of a table, nibbling on a peanut butter sandwich that her grandmother had made for her that morning. The bread was slightly stale, but Fiona didn't mind. Food was food, and there were days when even stale bread was a luxury they couldn't afford. When the final bell rang, Fiona was the first to leave, eager to escape the confines of the school building. The walk home was long and cold, but it gave her time to think, to lose herself in the complex mathematical problems that her grandfather had taught her to love. In her mind, numbers danced and transformed, equations unfolded like delicate origami, revealing their secrets to her one by one. At home, things weren't any better than at school. The small house that Fiona shared with her grandmother, Martha Harper, was cold and drafty, with furniture that had seen better days decades ago. Her grandmother, weakened by age and worry, did her best to take care of Fiona, but resources were scarce. Martha's pension barely covered the essentials, and the medical bills from Fiona's mother's illness had depleted what little savings they had. "How was school today, dear?" Martha asked as Fiona entered the kitchen, where her grandmother was carefully measuring out ingredients for a simple soup, mostly water, and the few vegetables they could afford. "Fine," Fiona replied, the lie coming easily to her lips. She never told her grandmother about the bullying, about Mr. Zander's cruelty. Martha had enough to worry about without adding Fiona's school troubles to the list. "Did you learn anything interesting?" Fiona shrugged off her coat, hanging it on the back of a kitchen chair. "Just more fractions." Martha smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said you had a gift for numbers." Fiona managed a small smile in return. "Is there anything I can help with?" "No, dear, I've got dinner under control. Why don't you go start on your homework?" Fiona nodded and headed to the small room she called her own, really just a converted storage space off the kitchen, barely large enough for a twin bed and a small desk. She pulled out her school books, though she knew she wouldn't need them. The homework Mr. Zanders had assigned, solving 20 fraction problems, would take her less than 5 minutes to complete. Instead, once she'd finished the simple assignment, Fiona pulled out a notebook from beneath her mattress, a special notebook, one that contained problems far more complex than anything her 5th grade class was studying. Problems that her grandfather had written out for her before he died, problems that she worked on late into the night when she couldn't sleep. For the next hour, Fiona lost herself in the world of numbers, a world where things made sense, where there were clear rules and patterns, where she didn't have to worry about fitting in or being judged. It was the only time she truly felt at peace. Later that evening, after a dinner of thin soup and bread that Fiona pretended to enjoy more than she actually did, she heard her grandmother coughing in the next room. The cough was deep and rattling, reminiscent of the cough that had preceded her mother's hospitalization. Worry gnawed at Fiona's insides as she listened to the harsh sound. They couldn't afford another illness, not now. Quietly, Fiona slipped out of bed and padded to her grandmother's room. Martha was sitting up in bed, a handkerchief pressed to her mouth, her thin shoulders shaking with each cough. "Grandma, are you okay?" Martha looked up, surprise flitting across her face before she forced a smile. "Of course, dear. Just a little tickle in my throat, nothing to worry about." But Fiona could see the sheen of sweat on her grandmother's forehead, the unhealthy flush in her cheeks. Martha was ill, perhaps seriously so, and was trying to hide it from her. "Should I call the doctor?" Fiona asked, though she already knew the answer. They couldn't afford a doctor, not unless it was absolutely necessary. No. "I'll be fine after a good night's sleep," Martha assured her, though they both knew it was a lie. "Go back to bed, Fiona. You have school tomorrow." Reluctantly, Fiona returned to her room, but sleep eluded her. She lay awake for hours, listening to her grandmother's coughing, her mind racing with worry. What would happen if Martha got too sick to work? What would happen to their already precarious financial situation? What would happen to her? As the night deepened, Fiona's worries gave way to a familiar determination. She would find a way to help her grandmother, to ensure they had enough money for medicine, for better food, for a warmer house. Somehow she would use her gift for mathematics to make things better for both of them. With that resolve firmly in mind, Fiona finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that the next day would bring challenges far greater than anything she had faced before. The morning dawned grey and forbidding, with heavy clouds promising more snow. Fiona awoke to the sound of her grandmother's coughing, now deeper and more concerning than it had been the night before. When she went to the kitchen, she found Martha leaning heavily against the counter, her face pale and drawn. "Grandma, you're sick," Fiona said, moving quickly to her grandmother's side. "You need to go back to bed." Martha shook her head weakly. "I'm fine, dear, just a little tired." But even as she spoke, her legs seemed to give way beneath her, and she would have fallen if Fiona hadn't been there to catch her. With a strength born of necessity, Fiona managed to help her grandmother back to bed. Martha's skin was hot to the touch, and her breathing was labored. This was no minor illness, Fiona realized with growing fear. This was serious. "I'm calling Mrs. Yates," Fiona decided, referring to their neighbor, a kind-hearted widow who had helped them in the past. "You need a doctor, Grandma." Too weak to protest, Martha simply closed her eyes, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. Fiona ran next door, her heart pounding with fear. Mrs. Yates, thankfully, was home and immediately came to their aid. She took one look at Martha and called for an ambulance, assuring Fiona that everything would be all right. But as the paramedics loaded her grandmother into the ambulance, Fiona wasn't so sure. The fear in their eyes, the urgency in their movements, it all spoke of a situation far more dire than they were willing to admit to a 9-year-old girl. "Can I go with her?" Fiona asked Mrs. Yates, her voice small and frightened. Mrs. Yates shook her head gently. "No, dear. You need to go to school. I'll stay with your grandmother at the hospital and come get you if there's any news." Fiona wanted to protest, to insist on staying with her grandmother, but she knew it would be useless. Adults had a way of making decisions for children, regardless of what the children wanted. So with a heavy heart, Fiona prepared for school. She dressed in the same clothes she'd worn the day before. She only had a few outfits to choose from, and set off through the snow, her mind far from the day's lessons. The journey to school was treacherous. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, covering the ice beneath in a deceptive blanket of white. Halfway there, Fiona slipped on a particularly slick patch, landing hard on her side in a slushy puddle, hidden beneath the snow. The freezing water soaked through her coat and jeans immediately, making her gasp with shock and discomfort. By the time she reached Lincoln Elementary, Fiona was not only late but also soaked and muddy. She hesitated at the entrance to Mr. Zander's classroom, knowing the reception that awaited her. But there was nowhere else to go, so she took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The classroom fell silent as Fiona entered, all eyes turning to take in her bedraggled appearance. Her jeans were soaked through to the knee. Her coat was splattered with mud, and her hair hung in wet strands around her face. She was shivering uncontrollably, both from cold and from the scrutiny of her classmates. Mr. Zanders, who had been in the middle of explaining a concept, stopped abruptly. His eyes narrowed as they landed on Fiona, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, class," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "it looks like we've got a lost beggar. Should we teach her math or ask for spare change for her?" The class erupted in laughter, and Fiona felt her face flame with humiliation. Not even in her worst nightmares could she have imagined such cruelty, especially not today, when her grandmother was being rushed to the hospital. I'm sorry I'm late, she stammered, her voice barely audible over the laughter. My grandmother. She is sick and— Spare us your excuses, Miss Harper, Mr. Zanders cut her off. And please try not to drip all over my classroom floor. The janitor has enough to do without cleaning up after you. Fresh peals of laughter followed this remark, and Fiona, fighting back tears, made her way to her seat. She was acutely aware of the wet, squelching sound her shoes made with each step, of the trail of water she left on the floor, of the whispers and giggles that followed her progress. As she sat down, she heard a girl behind her whisper, "She smells like a wet dog," followed by muffled laughter. Fiona kept her eyes fixed on her desk, willing herself not to cry, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply their words cut her. Mr. Zanders resumed his lesson, but Fiona could hardly focus. Her clothes clung uncomfortably to her, skin cold and clammy, and her thoughts kept returning to her grandmother lying pale and sick in an ambulance. What if Martha didn't get better? What would happen to her then? The day stretched endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. By the time the lunch bell rang, Fiona was shivering so badly that her teeth chattered. Her clothes had begun to dry, but the process had left them stiff and even more uncomfortable than before. In the cafeteria, Fiona realized with a sinking heart that in the rush to get her grandmother to the hospital, she had forgotten to pack a lunch. She had no money to buy food, so she simply sat at her usual isolated table, trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice Zoe Mitchell approaching until the girl was standing right beside her. Zoe, with her designer clothes and perfectly styled hair, was one of the most popular girls in the 5th grade. She rarely acknowledged Fiona's existence except to mock her. "Here," Zoe said, placing a sandwich on the table in front of Fiona. "My mom always packs too much food anyway." Fiona looked up in surprise, certain this was some kind of trick. But Zoe's expression for once held no mockery, only a kind of awkward sympathy. "Thanks," Fiona said cautiously, still half expecting the other shoe to drop. Zoe shrugged, already turning away. "Whatever. Just don't tell anyone I gave it to you." Fiona watched Zoe return to her table of friends, her mind whirling with confusion. Why would Zoe, who had never shown her anything but contempt, suddenly offer her food? It didn't make sense, but hunger eventually overrode suspicion, and Fiona ate the sandwich gratefully, savoring each bite of what was probably the most filling meal she'd had in days. The afternoon passed marginally better than the morning. Fiona's clothes had dried completely, making her more comfortable, and the sandwich had quieted the hunger pangs in her stomach. By the time the final bell rang, she was almost feeling hopeful. Maybe her grandmother wasn't as sick as she had feared. Maybe Mrs. Yates would be waiting for her at home with good news. But as Fiona left the school building, she saw Mrs. Yates's car parked at the curb, and her heart sank. If Mrs. Yates was here, it meant news from the hospital, and given the worried expression on the older woman's face as she spotted Fiona, it wasn't good news. "Fiona, dear," Mrs. Yates called, waving her over. "Come quickly, we need to get—" Back to the hospital. Fiona's stomach clenched with fear as she hurried to the car. "Is Grandma okay?" Mrs. Yates hesitated, clearly weighing how much to tell her. She's very sick, Fiona. The doctors are doing everything they can, but she's asking for you." The drive to the hospital was a blur. Fiona sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a prayer repeating in her mind. "Please let Grandma be okay. Please let Grandma be okay. Please let Grandma be okay." But when they arrived at the hospital and were led to Martha's room, Fiona knew immediately that her prayers had gone unanswered. Her grandmother lay small and frail in the hospital bed, her face ashen, her breathing shallow and labored. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines that beeped and hummed around her. "Grandma," Fiona whispered, approaching the bed hesitantly. Martha's eyes fluttered open, and a weak smile touched her lips when she saw Fiona. "There's my girl," she said, her voice barely audible. "Come sit with me a while." Fiona perched on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb any of the tubes or wires. She took her grandmother's hand, alarmed by how cold and papery the skin felt. "The doctors say I have pneumonia," Martha told her, each word clearly an effort. It's quite serious, Fiona." Fiona felt tears welling in her eyes. "But you're going to get better, right? The doctors can make you better." Martha's eyes clouded with pain, both physical and emotional. "I hope so, dear. But we need to be prepared for all possibilities." "No," Fiona said, shaking her head fiercely. "No, you're going to be fine. You have to be fine." She couldn't bear the thought of losing her grandmother, the only family she had left, the only person in the world who truly loved her. "Fiona, listen to me," Martha said, squeezing her hand with what little strength she had. "Whatever happens, you must be brave. You must continue with your schooling. Your gift for mathematics, it's special, Fiona. It could take you places, give you opportunities that neither I nor your mother ever had. Promise me you won't waste it." Tears were streaming down Fiona's face now. "I promise, Grandma, but please, please don't leave me." Martha lifted a trembling hand to wipe away Fiona's tears. "I'll fight as hard as I can, my dear. For you, I'll fight with everything I have." They sat together for hours, talking softly when Martha had the strength, sitting in companionable silence when she didn't. Mrs. Yates remained with them, a quiet, supportive presence in the corner of the room. When visiting hours came to an end, a nurse gently informed them that they would need to leave. Fiona clung to her grandmother, desperate not to be separated from her, but Mrs. Yates firmly led her away, promising they would return first thing in the morning. That night, in Mrs. Yates's spare bedroom, Fiona couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with images of her grandmother lying in that sterile hospital bed, looking so small and vulnerable, so unlike the strong, capable woman who had raised her. The thought that Martha might not recover was too painful to contemplate, yet it was all Fiona could think about. From that day on, Fiona nearly gave up on everything. School became an even more hostile environment as rumors about her grandmother's illness spread, fueling new waves of mockery. Mr. Zanders's cruelty intensified, as if Fiona's personal tragedy gave him license to be even more callous. "Perhaps if you paid more attention in class instead of daydreaming, Miss Harper, your family might not be in such dire straits," he said one day after Fiona had failed to respond to a question because she was thinking about her grandmother, who remained hospitalized. The comment felt like a slap, and for the first time, Fiona felt anger rising within her, hot and fierce and powerful. How dare he? How dare he imply that her grandmother's illness was somehow her fault? How dare he mock her pain? But the anger, powerful as it was, couldn't sustain her. Exhaustion from sleepless nights spent worrying, hunger from the meager meals Mrs. Yates could afford to provide, and the constant stress of her grandmother's precarious health all took their toll. Fiona withdrew further into herself, speaking less, participating in class only when directly required to, her once bright eyes dulled by grief and fear. During the late nights at Mrs. Yates's home, when sleep eluded her, Fiona would pull out her special notebook and lose herself in the mathematical problems her grandfather had left her. In those moments, she could almost hear his voice again, warm and encouraging. "You're special, Fiona, you just have to believe it." And somewhere deep inside her, a tiny spark of determination refused to be extinguished. She might be down, she might be bruised, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Weeks passed, and Martha's condition fluctuated, some days bringing hope, others despair. Fiona visited the hospital every day after school, doing her homework on a small table in her grandmother's room, filling the silence with chatter about her day, carefully edited to exclude the bullying and Mr. Zanders's cruelty, and reading aloud from books Martha enjoyed. At school, Fiona continued to endure Mr. Zanders's targeted humiliation. Each day brought a new barb, a new way for him to belittle her in front of her classmates, and though she had grown somewhat numb to his taunts, each one still left a mark on her already battered self-esteem. One particular Thursday in February, Mr. Zanders decided to hold an impromptu math competition in class, a series of increasingly difficult problems that students would solve on the blackboard in front of everyone. The winner would receive a coveted prize, exemption from the next week's homework assignment. Fiona sat at her desk, hoping desperately not to be called. Public speaking of any kind was terrifying enough without the added pressure of Mr. Zander's watchful gaze, ready to pounce on any mistake. But of course her name was the first one called. "Miss Harper," Mr. Zanders said with a smirk, "why don't you start us off? Let's see if you can solve a simple problem without assistance." Reluctantly, Fiona made her way to the front of the classroom, acutely aware of the snickers and whispers that followed her progress. "Mr. Zanders wrote a problem on the board, one involving complex fractions with variables far beyond what they had been studying in class." "Take your time," he said, his tone making it clear that he expected her to fail miserably. Fiona stared at the problem, and something strange happened. The numbers and variables, instead of being intimidating, seemed to arrange themselves in her mind with perfect clarity. She saw the solution path as clearly as if it were illuminated in neon. Without hesitation, she picked up the chalk and began to work through the problem, her small hand moving confidently across the blackboard. Step by step, she reduced, simplified, and solved, not once looking back at her teacher or classmates. When she finished, she placed the chalk back in its tray and turned to face the class. The room was completely silent. Every face, including Mr. Zanders, was a mask of shock. "That's as correct," Mr. Zanders finally said, his voice strained with disbelief. "But surely you've seen this problem before, or perhaps someone helped." "You prepare," Fiona shook her head. "No, sir, I just solved it." "It's impossible," Mr. Zanders muttered, but he had no choice but to allow Fiona to return to her seat, the first round of the competition won. As the competition continued, Fiona watched her classmates tackle simpler problems, many struggling even with those. When it was time for the second round, Mr. Zanders called her up again, clearly determined to prove that her first success had been a fluke. This time, he wrote an even more complex problem on the board, one involving algebraic expressions that he knew they hadn't covered in class yet. Once again, Fiona solved it without hesitation, her mind making connections and seeing patterns that others couldn't perceive. And once again, the class fell silent as she completed the problem correctly. By the third round, Mr. Zanders was visibly flustered. He wrote a problem on the board that was college level at least, a challenge he himself had struggled with in his advanced mathematics courses. Fiona approached it with the same calm confidence, breaking it down step by step, applying principles and techniques that she had taught herself from her grandfather's old textbooks. When she placed the final answer on the board, a gasp went through the classroom. Even Mr. Zanders couldn't deny it anymore. "Where did you learn to do this?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of shock and something that might almost have been admiration. Fiona, for the first time in months, felt a small surge of pride. "My grandfather taught me," she said simply. "Before he died, he said I had a gift for numbers." Mr. Zanders stared at her for a long moment, then cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, it seems the competition is over. Miss Harper is the clear winner." As Fiona returned to her seat, she was surprised to see a few of her classmates looking at her with newfound respect. Zoe Mitchell, who had continued to slip her extra food at lunch occasionally, even gave her a small smile. But the victory, sweet as it was, couldn't overshadow the worry that still consumed Fiona. After school, she hurried to the hospital, eager to share the news of her success with her grandmother. She found Martha sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had in weeks. The color had returned somewhat to her cheeks, and her eyes brightened when she saw Fiona. "Good news, my dear," Martha said, as Fiona took her usual seat by the bed. "The doctors say I'm improving. The new antibiotics seem to be working." Relief flooded through Fiona, so intense that for a moment she thought she might pass out. "Really, Grandma, you're getting better?" Martha nodded, smiling. "It will be a while yet before I'm fully recovered, but yes, I'm on the mend. And more good news. Mrs. Yates found some of my old insurance paperwork. It turns out I'm covered. For most of the hospital expenses, we won't lose the house after all." Tears of joy sprang to Fiona's eyes. After weeks of nothing but bad news and struggle, finally things were looking up. "I have good news too, Grandma," Fiona said, wiping away her tears. "We had a math competition in class today, and I won. Mr. Zanders couldn't believe it. He kept giving me harder and harder problems, but I solved them all. Martha's face glowed with pride. I always knew you were special, Fiona. Your grandfather saw it too. He'd be so proud of you today. For the first time in what felt like forever, Fiona went to sleep that night with a lightness in her heart. Her grandmother was improving. Their financial situation wasn't as dire as they had feared, and she had proven herself in front of her entire class. Perhaps things were finally turning around. Little did she know that an even greater opportunity was about to present itself. One that would change the course of her life forever. The next morning, Fiona received the shock of her life in the form of an unexpected visitor to Mrs. Yates's house. She had finished her breakfast and was washing her plate at the sink when the doorbell rang. Mrs. Yates answered it, and a moment later called for Fiona. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, Fiona made her way to the front hall, only to stop short at the sight of the woman standing there. She recognized her immediately, Dr. Juncker, the principal of Lincoln Elementary. "Hello, Fiona," Dr. Juncker said, her usually stern face softened by what looked like excitement. "I hope I'm not intruding too early in the morning, but I have some news that couldn't wait." Confused and a little alarmed, principals didn't normally make house calls after all. Fiona glanced at Mrs. Yates, who looked as puzzled as she felt. "It's about your performance in Mr. Zander's class yesterday," Dr. Juncker continued. "He came to see me after school, quite beside himself with excitement. He told me about the extraordinary math skills you demonstrated." Fiona felt herself blushing. She had never been comfortable with praise, especially not from authority figures. "It was just a few problems," she mumbled, looking down at her shoes. "Few problems," Dr. Juncker exclaimed. "Fiona, you solved college-level mathematical equations without any apparent effort. That's not just a few problems, that's extraordinary." Fiona didn't know how to respond to this, so she remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "What's even more extraordinary," Dr. Juncker went on, "is what I found when I looked through your academic records. Your standardized test scores in mathematics are off the charts, Fiona. They're the highest I've ever seen in my 30 years in education. Yet your classroom performance has been mediocre at best." At this, Fiona did look up. I didn't want to stand out," she admitted softly. Dr. Juncker's expression softened further. "Fiona, I understand that you've been going through a very difficult time, and that your home situation has been challenging. I also know that you've experienced some difficulties in the classroom." Her tone made it clear that she was aware of Mr. Zander's behavior toward Fiona and was not pleased about it. "But I'm here today because an extraordinary opportunity has presented itself," Dr. Juncker continued, her voice taking on an excitement that Fiona had never heard from the usually reserved principal. "The state's annual Mathematics Olympiad is accepting applications for this year's competition. It's usually for students in grades 7 through 12, but after hearing about your performance yesterday, I took the liberty of submitting your name, with some samples of the work you did in class, for special consideration." Fiona's heart began to pound. She had heard of the Mathematics Olympiad, of course. It was a prestigious competition that attracted the brightest young mathematicians from across the state. Winners often received scholarships and other academic opportunities that could set them on a path to the nation's top universities. "This morning, I received a call from the Olympiad Committee," Dr. Juncker said, a smile breaking across her face. "Fiona, your entry for the State Math Olympiad was accepted, and you were selected as a finalist, the youngest finalist in the history of the competition." Time seemed to slow down as the implications of Dr. Juncker's words sank in. Fiona, the girl who sat at the back of the class trying to be invisible, who endured daily humiliation and cruelty, who worried about whether there would be enough food on the table, this same Fiona had been selected to compete against the best young mathematicians in the state. But how will I get there?" Fiona asked, practical concerns immediately rising to the surface. "The competition must be in Lansing, and Grandma's in the hospital, and we don't have a car, and—" "All taken care of," Dr. Juncker interrupted gently. "The school will arrange transportation for you, and I'll personally accompany you to the competition. All expenses are covered by the Olympiad Committee." Mrs. Yates, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward. "This is wonderful news, Fiona. Your grandmother will be so proud when we tell her." Fiona felt dizzy with the sudden reversal of her fortunes. Just yesterday, she had been the object of mockery and disdain. Today, she was being celebrated as a mathematical prodigy, worthy of competing in the state's most prestigious competition. "When is it?" she asked, her voice small with wonder. 3 weeks from now, on a Saturday," Dr. Juncker replied. "Which gives us just enough time to prepare. With your permission, Mrs. Yates, I'd like to arrange for Fiona to receive some special coaching after school. One of our high school math teachers, Ms. Adams, is a former Olympiad competitor herself and has offered to work with Fiona." Mrs. Yates nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, anything that will help her succeed." Fiona's mind was spinning with the implications of this sudden change. How about Mr. Zander's class?" she asked, fearing that her daily tormentor would find a way to spoil even this opportunity. Dr. Juncker's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Zanders will be adjusting his teaching approach, especially where you're concerned, Fiona. We've had a discussion about appropriate classroom conduct." The idea that someone had stood up for her, had called Mr. Zanders to account for his behavior, was almost as shocking to Fiona as being selected for the Olympiad. For so long she had accepted his cruelty as simply her lot in life, something to be endured rather than challenged. That afternoon, when Fiona visited her grandmother in the hospital and shared the news, Martha's joy was tempered with concern. "It's a wonderful opportunity, dear, truly it is," Martha said, taking Fiona's hand in hers. "But will it be too much pressure, with me still in the hospital, and you staying with Mrs. Yates and all the extra studying?" "I want to do it, Grandma," Fiona said with a certainty that surprised even her. "I want to show what I can do. And maybe—" She hesitated, almost afraid to voice the hope that had begun to form in her mind. "Maybe if I do well, there might be scholarships. For better schools, maybe even for college someday." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Your grandfather always said you'd go far, Fiona. I think he knew even then just how special your gift is." The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Every afternoon after school, Fiona met with Ms. Adams, the high school math teacher, who was both impressed by Fiona's natural abilities and determined to help her develop them further. "You have an intuitive understanding of mathematical concepts that most people never achieve, even after years of study," Ms. Adams told her during one of their sessions. "But intuition alone won't be enough at the Olympiad. You need to be able to show your work, to explain your reasoning, to demonstrate not just that you can find the answer, but that you understand the principles behind it." Fiona soaked up Ms. Adams's guidance like a sponge. For the first time in her academic life, she was being challenged, pushed to her limits, expected to excel rather than to shrink into the background, and she thrived under the attention. At the same time, subtle changes were occurring in her social life at school. Word had spread about her selection for the Olympiad, and her classmates' attitudes toward her shifted. The mockery didn't disappear entirely. There were still those who resented her sudden elevation from outcast to prodigy, but it was tempered now by a grudging respect. Most surprising of all was the change in Mr. Zanders. Gone was the cruel sarcasm, the public humiliation, the barely concealed contempt. In its place was an awkward attempt at kindness, as if he were trying to make amends but wasn't quite sure how. "Miss Harper," he said after class one day when the other students had filed out, "I wanted to, that is, I thought you might find these useful." He handed her a stack of books, advanced mathematics texts that were far beyond the 5th grade curriculum. "They helped me when I was preparing for my college entrance exams." Fiona accepted the books with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Thank you, Mr. Zanders." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I also wanted to say, sir, that is, I hope you know that I—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with the apology he couldn't quite bring himself to articulate. Fiona, taking pity on him despite everything, nodded. "I'll make good use of these," she said, indicating the books, offering him an out that he gratefully took. As the day of the competition drew nearer, Fiona's anxiety mounted. Despite all her preparation, despite Ms. Adams' assurances that she was more than ready, she couldn't help but worry. What if she froze under pressure? What if the other competitors, older and more experienced, were simply too far ahead of her? What if she let down all the people who were now counting on her to succeed? The night before the Olympiad, she visited her grandmother, who was scheduled to be released from the hospital the following week. Martha, looking stronger than she had in months, sensed Fiona's nervousness. "You know," she said, patting the edge of the bed for Fiona to sit beside her, "your grandfather used to say that mathematics is like music. It's not just about getting the notes right. It's about feeling the rhythm, hearing the melody in your mind." Fiona smiled at the memory of her grandfather, wishing fiercely that he could be there to see her compete. "I'm scared, Grandma," she admitted. "What if I let everyone down?" Martha stroked Fiona's copper hair gently. "You could never let me down, my dear. Win or lose, what matters is that you're using the gifts you've been given. That's all any of us can do." Saturday dawned clear and cold, a perfect Michigan winter day. Dr. Juncker picked Fiona up from Mrs. Yates's house at 7 a.m. for the drive to Lansing. Fiona was wearing her best outfit, a simple blue dress that had once belonged to her mother, carefully altered by Mrs. Yates to fit her smaller frame, and a warm coat that Dr. Juncker had happened to find in the school's lost and found, though Fiona strongly suspected it had been purchased specifically for her. The journey to Lansing took just over an hour, during which Dr. Juncker chatted about nothing in particular, clearly trying to keep Fiona's mind off the upcoming competition. It wasn't entirely successful. Fiona's stomach was in knots, and she couldn't stop mentally reviewing all the problem-solving strategies Ms. Adams had taught her, but she appreciated the effort. When they arrived at the convention center where the Olympiad was being held, Fiona was momentarily overwhelmed by the scale of the event. Hundreds of students milled about in the entrance hall, many accompanied by parents or teachers, all exuding an air of nervous excitement. "Remember," Dr. Juncker said as she led Fiona to the registration desk, "you've earned your place here just as much as any of them, and regardless of the outcome today, we're all incredibly proud of you." After registering and receiving her competitor's badge, Fiona was directed to a large auditorium where the competition would take place. Row upon row of tables had been set up, each with a placard bearing a competitor's name. Fiona found her place near the front of the room, alphabetical order by last name, and sat down, trying to calm her racing heart. Looking around, she saw that she was indeed the youngest person in the room by several years. The other competitors had already begun to take their seats, armed with state-of-the-art calculators, expensive pens and pencils, and a confidence that came from privilege and preparation. Fiona glanced down at her own supplies, a second-hand calculator that Mrs. Yates had found at a garage sale, a handful of well-used pencils, and her grandfather's old pocket watch, which she had brought as a good luck charm. In that moment, the disparity between herself and the other competitors seemed insurmountable, but then she remembered her grandfather's words, which her grandmother had reminded her of just the night before. Mathematics is like music. It's not just about getting the notes right, it's about feeling the rhythm. Taking a deep breath, Fiona closed her eyes and let the numbers dance in her mind, let the equations unfold like the familiar and beloved melodies they were to her. When she opened her eyes again, her hands had stopped shaking. The competition began with a series of written problems, each more difficult than the last. Fiona worked steadily, methodically, letting her intuitive understanding guide her while also carefully documenting each step of her reasoning, as Ms. Adams had taught her. Time seemed to both stretch and compress, minutes blurring into hours, as she lost herself in the elegant world of mathematics. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the written portion, Fiona was surprised to find that she had completed all the problems with time to spare. Looking around, she saw many competitors still frantically writing, racing against the clock to finish their work. After a short lunch break, during which Dr. Juncker attempted to distract Fiona with small talk, while subtly assessing how she felt the competition was going, the 10 highest scorers from the written round were announced. These finalists would participate in an oral round, solving complex problems on a whiteboard in front of judges and an audience. When Fiona's name was called, not just as a finalist, but as the top scorer from the written round, she almost didn't believe it. Dr. Juncker had to gently nudge her to her feet and towards the stage where the other finalists were gathering. The oral round was even more intimidating than the written portion had been. Each finalist was given a problem to solve, while the audience and judges watched, evaluating not just the accuracy of the solution, but the elegance and clarity of the approach. When it was Fiona's turn, she stood before the whiteboard, marker in hand, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes upon her. The problem was presented, a complex optimization scenario involving variables and constraints. For a heart-stopping moment, Fiona's mind went blank. The symbols on the page seemed to swim before her eyes, refusing to resolve into meaning. Then, like a distant melody growing clearer, the mathematical pattern revealed itself to her. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, writing out equations, transforming them step by step, approaching the solution. As she worked, the anxiety fell away, replaced by the pure joy of mathematical discovery. This was what her grandfather had meant, this feeling of harmony and rightness as the numbers aligned themselves perfectly. When she placed the marker down and turned to face the judges, Fiona knew with a quiet certainty that her solution was not just correct, but elegant. The judges' expressions, surprise mixed with admiration, confirmed it. The deliberation after the final competitor had finished seemed to take an eternity. Fiona sat with the other finalists in a small room off the main auditorium, each lost in their own thoughts. Some chatted nervously, comparing their approaches to the problems. Others sat in tense silence. Fiona found herself drawn into conversation with a high school junior named Paul, who seemed genuinely interested in how she, a fifth grader, had developed such advanced mathematical skills. "My grandfather," she explained, feeling a familiar pang at his memory. "He saw that I liked numbers and just kept teaching me, even after I'd gone beyond what they taught in school." Paul nodded thoughtfully. "That's how it was for me too. My dad's a professor at MSU. He'd bring home these puzzles for me to solve, always making it a game. Before I knew it, I was doing calculus for fun." He grinned, then added more seriously, "You did great out there, by the way. Your solution to the optimization problem was brilliant." Coming from a competitor who was 7 years her senior, the praise meant more to Fiona than she could express. Finally, they were called back to the auditorium for the announcement of the winners. Fiona's hands were sweating as she took her place on stage with the other finalists. Dr. Juncker was in the front row, her face a picture of anxious hope. The third-place winner was announced, a high school senior who was headed to MIT in the fall. Then the second-place winner, Paul, who gave Fiona a thumbs up as he stepped forward to receive his medal. And the first-place winner of this year's Michigan Mathematics Olympiad, the head judge announced, with the highest combined score in the history of the competition, Fiona Harper. For a moment, Fiona couldn't move. She must have misheard. There was no way she, a fifth grader from a struggling family, could have outperformed high school students bound for the Ivy League. But the applause was deafening, and Dr. Juncker was on her feet, clapping wildly, tears streaming down her face, and Paul was gently pushing her forward, whispering, "Go on, you earned it." As Fiona stepped forward to receive her medal and trophy, she spotted a familiar face in the audience, Mrs. Yates, who must have driven up for the ceremony, and beside her, in a wheelchair but beaming with pride, was her grandmother. Martha had somehow convinced her doctors to allow her a day pass from the hospital to attend the competition. Clutching her trophy, Fiona made her way to her grandmother as soon as the ceremony concluded. Martha enfolded her in a fierce hug, whispering, "Your grandfather sees you, Fiona. He knows. He's so proud of you. We both are." The drive back to Detroit was a celebration. Mrs. Yates had brought a small cake which they ate in the car, and Dr. Juncker couldn't stop talking about the scholarship opportunities that would now be available to Fiona. Universities had special programs for exceptional students like her, the principal explained. With the right support, there were no limits to what Fiona could achieve. Martha, exhausted but happy, dozed in the back seat beside Fiona, who kept one hand on her grandmother's arm, as if to reassure herself that this wasn't all a dream. When they arrived back in Detroit, a surprise was waiting at Lincoln Elementary. where Dr. Juncker had suggested they stop before heading home. The school building should have been empty on a Saturday evening, but as they pulled into the parking lot, Fiona was astonished to see a group of people waiting outside, her classmates led by Zoe Mitchell and several teachers, including Ms. Adams and, to her great surprise, Mr. Zanders. As Fiona emerged from the car, trophy in hand, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. Zoe rushed forward, enveloping Fiona in an enthusiastic hug before stepping back, slightly embarrassed by her own display of affection. "We watched the live stream of the competition," Zoe explained. "Dr. Juncker sent us the link. You were amazing." More surprising than this unexpected welcome committee was the person who stepped forward next, Mr. Zanders, looking uncharacteristically humble. He was holding a piece of paper, which he extended to Fiona with a hand that trembled slightly. "Fiona," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to apologize and say that honestly, you've taught me more than I could ever teach you." The paper, Fiona discovered, was a letter of recommendation he had written for her, addressed to the principal of the Michigan Academy for Mathematics and Science, a prestigious school for gifted students. In it, he had not only praised her mathematical abilities, but had also, with painful honesty, acknowledged his own failure as her teacher and the resilience she had shown in the face of adversity, including his own cruelty. This time, the applause came from everyone, not just for the prize, but because, even crushed by circumstances, Fiona had proven that no one, not the cold, not the hunger, not the contempt, could ever stop true genius. Have you ever known someone whose hidden talents were overlooked or dismissed by those around them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the months that followed, Fiona's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The scholarship she received from the Olympiad provided not only for her education, but also included a stipend for living expenses. With these resources and the insurance settlement from Martha's hospitalization, they were able to repair their small house, making it warm and secure for the first time in years. Martha's health improved steadily, and by spring, she was well, enough to resume her part-time job at the local library. The burden of financial worry that had weighed so heavily on both of them began to lift, allowing Fiona to focus on her studies without the constant anxiety that had been her companion for so long. At school, the transformation was equally dramatic. Mr. Zanders, true to his word, had become Fiona's most vocal advocate. He worked with Dr. Juncker to develop an individualized curriculum that challenged Fiona's mathematical abilities while still allowing her to interact with her peers in other subjects. For the first time, Fiona felt seen and valued in the classroom, her contributions welcomed rather than mocked. Her classmates, too, had undergone a change in attitude. The same children who had once laughed at her worn clothes and quiet demeanor now sought her help with their math homework, invited her to birthday parties, included her in playground games. Zoe Mitchell, in particular, had appointed herself as Fiona's unofficial best friend, staunchly defending her against any lingering prejudice. "You know," Zoe said one day as they walked home from school together, "I always knew you were smart. Even before the competition. That's why I used to give you my extra lunch sometimes." Fiona looked at her in surprise. "I thought you were just feeling sorry for me." Zoe shook her head emphatically. "No way. I admired you. You never complained, even when things were really bad, and you never gave up, not even when Mr. Zanders was being, well, you know, a complete jerk," Fiona suggested, and they both dissolved into giggles. It wasn't just Fiona's social life at school that had improved. With the support of Ms. Adams and Mr. Zanders, she had applied to and been accepted into a summer program at the University of Michigan for mathematically gifted youth. The program would allow her to study advanced topics under the guidance of university professors while still maintaining her connections to her school and community. Perhaps most meaningful of all, Fiona had started a small tutoring group at the local community center, helping other children from disadvantaged backgrounds discover the joy of mathematics. Remembering how her grandfather had nurtured her own talent, she was determined to pass on that legacy of encouragement and belief. "You don't have to be a genius," she told her young students. "You just have to be curious and persistent and is willing to make mistakes. One evening in late spring, as Fiona and Martha sat on the newly repaired front porch of their home, enjoying the lengthening daylight, Martha asked a question that had been on her mind for some time. "Fiona, do you ever think about what would have happened if Dr. Juncker hadn't entered you in that competition, if your talent had remained hidden?" Fiona considered this for a moment, watching as a robin hopped across their small yard searching for worms in the soft earth. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember what Grandpa used to say, that truth always finds a way to the surface, like water seeking its own level." Martha smiled, her eyes misting with memories. "He was a wise man, your grandfather, and he would be so proud of the young woman you're becoming, not just because of your mathematical gifts, but because of your kindness, your perseverance, your willingness to help others." Fiona leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder, feeling a contentment that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. "I still miss him," she said softly. "As do I, my dear. Every day. But I believe he's watching over us, guiding us still, just as he guided Dr. Juncker to recognize your talent, and Mrs. Yates to be there when we needed her, and even Mr. Zanders to see the error of his ways. And you to get better," Fiona added, squeezing her grandmother's hand. "Yes," Martha agreed, "and me to get better, because our story wasn't finished yet, was it? We still had important work to do in this world." As the spring evening deepened into twilight, Fiona thought about all the changes that had occurred in her life, from the desperate, hungry child hiding her intelligence to avoid further persecution, to the confident young mathematician she was becoming. The journey had been difficult, filled with hardship and pain, but it had also brought unexpected blessings, true friends, supportive mentors, opportunities she had never dreamed possible. What would the future hold? More competition, certainly. College someday, perhaps at MIT or Stanford or Princeton. A career in mathematics or physics or engineering. But beyond these academic milestones, Fiona hoped for something more. A life that honored her grandfather's memory, that repaid the kindness of those who had believed in her, that opened doors for others as doors had been opened for her. For now, though, sitting beside her grandmother as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky, Fiona was content to simply be a girl who had discovered her own worth, who had learned that true genius lay not just in solving complex equations but in persevering through life's most difficult challenges with courage and grace. In the distance, a whip-poor-will began its evening song, a mathematical pattern of notes that rose and fell with perfect precision. Fiona closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm, feeling the melody in her heart, and knew that whatever came next, she was ready to face it, not alone, but surrounded by the love and support she had earned through her own quiet bravery. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel,